There are moments in life that split time in two, before and after, and Kang Junseo had always believed he had already lived through his. 5 years ago, when he signed the final divorce papers, he told himself that chapter was closed, sealed neatly behind ambition and necessity. Love, he decided, was a luxury men like him could not afford. Today was meant to be proof of that belief. The automatic doors of the jewelry boutique slid open with a soft chime as Junseo stepped inside, the quiet elegance of the space matching the careful control he carried on his shoulders. Glass cases shimmered under warm lights, diamonds catching reflections like frozen stars. This was not his usual environment. Boardrooms and private offices suited him better, but buying an engagement ring required presence, or at least the appearance of it. His assistant had offered to handle everything. He had refused. Some decisions, even arranged ones, demanded a man's own hand. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and approached the counter, his expression neutral, practiced. The marriage ahead had been agreed upon by families, discussed in hushed meetings, signed off like a business merger. Respectable. Strategic. Safe. There would be no surprises here. That was the point. "Good afternoon," a woman's voice said softly. Junseo looked up, and the world shifted. For a heartbeat he did not breathe. Behind the counter stood Aaliyah Brooks. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture calm and professional, but her face was unmistakable. The same warm brown eyes, now more guarded. The same lips he once knew every smile of, now set in polite composure. She was real. Solid. Standing less than 3 feet away from him, holding a velvet tray as if this were any ordinary day. Time collapsed inward, dragging memories with it. Aaliyah's gaze met his, and something flickered there, surprise, recognition, and then a careful mask sliding into place. If she felt the same shock tearing through him, she did not show it. Instead, she offered a measured smile that did not reach her eyes. "Welcome," she said again, as if he were just another customer. "How may I help you today?" The question landed like a quiet blow. Junseo opened his mouth, then closed it. For years, he had imagined what he would say if he ever saw her again. Apologies. Explanations. Regret shaped into words sharp enough to cut through silence. Yet now, faced with her calm professionalism, he found none of them suitable. "I'm looking for an engagement ring," he managed. The word engagement seemed to echo between them, filling the space with invisible weight. Aaliyah's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the tray before she set it down. "Of course," she replied evenly. "Do you have something specific in mind?" Her voice was steady, but Junseo noticed the smallest pause before she spoke, the way her shoulders lifted as she drew a breath. She was bracing herself. For him. "I'm not sure," he said, and for once the uncertainty in his voice was genuine. Aaliyah nodded, already moving into motion, unlocking a case and selecting a few rings with careful precision. As she spoke, explaining cuts, settings, clarity, her tone was professional, almost distant. She did not acknowledge their past, did not mention his name, did not ask how he had been. It was both merciful and unbearable. Junseo watched her hands as she worked, memories pressing in uninvited. Those same hands once rested against his chest during quiet mornings. Once reached for him without hesitation. He wondered when they had learned to be so careful. "You can take your time," Aaliyah said, placing the rings before him. "This is an important decision." Her eyes lifted briefly, meeting his again. In that glance he saw it, the unspoken truth. This was not just about a ring. It never had been. "I didn't know you worked here," he said softly, the first honest sentence he had spoken since walking in. "I didn't know you'd come," she replied. There it was. Not accusation. Not warmth. Just fact. Silence settled between them, heavy but controlled. Around them, the store remained peaceful, unaware that two lives once deeply entwined were standing on opposite sides of a glass counter, pretending they had not broken each other. Junseo straightened, instinctively reaching for the composure that had built his empire. But it faltered. "I think I need more time," he said finally, pushing the tray back toward her. "I'll come back." Aaliyah nodded once. "Take all the time you need." As he turned to leave, the bell chimed again, marking his exit. But Junseo knew something else had been set into motion, something far more consequential than an engagement ring. He had come to confirm a future chosen for him. Instead, he had walked straight into the past he never truly let go. And this time he wasn't sure walking away would be so easy. Some love stories end with shouting, with doors slammed hard enough to shake the walls. Others end with silence so complete it convinces you nothing important was lost. Aaliyah and Junseo's marriage belonged to the second kind, the kind that disappeared quietly, leaving only echoes that lingered far longer than noise ever could. They had met years earlier in a way that felt ordinary at the time but would later feel inevitable. Aaliyah had been newly graduated, working part-time at an art gallery while figuring out her future. Junseok had visited on behalf of a foundation his company funded, expecting a brief tour and polite conversation. Instead, he found himself talking to a woman who spoke with calm honesty, who asked questions without fear and listened without judgment. There was no spark that announced itself dramatically, just comfort, familiarity. That ease became friendship, and friendship slowly became love. Their relationship unfolded away from flashing cameras and corporate scrutiny. Junseok was not yet the billionaire the world would later fear and admire. He was ambitious, yes, but still human in his hopes. With Aaliyah he was not Kang Junseok, he was simply Jun, a man who laughed easily and dreamed aloud. Aaliyah loved him not for where he was headed, but for how safe he made her feel when the world felt uncertain. When he proposed, it was simple. No press. No spectacle. Just a quiet promise spoken in a small apartment filled with mismatched furniture and shared dreams. Aaliyah said yes without hesitation. Marriage followed the same way, intimate, private, sincere. They built routines together. Late dinners, shared mornings, long conversations about nothing and everything. They learned each other's silences. They supported each other's goals. For a time love felt enough. But success has a way of changing the air around it. As Junseok's company expanded, expectations tightened. Meetings grew longer. Travel became constant. His family's influence, once distant, moved closer, heavier with tradition and unspoken rules. Questions began to surface. About appearances. About legacy. About whether love alone was sufficient for a man expected to carry an empire. Aaliyah noticed the change before he ever spoke of it. The way his shoulders stayed tense even at home. The way conversations drifted unfinished. She asked gently, giving him space to be honest. Junseok always promised things would settle soon. He believed it himself. But pressure does not always announce when it is becoming unbearable. It creeps in, convincing you that sacrifice is noble and silence is protection. Junseok began to think he was shielding Aaliyah by keeping his struggles to himself. He convinced himself that the world he was being pulled into was too harsh for her kindness, too demanding for her peace. So he made the worst decision of his life quietly. No fight preceded it. No betrayal. Just a conversation held too late at night, his voice steady while his heart unraveled. He told her he thought it would be better if they separated. That their lives were moving in different directions. That she deserved more than what he could give. Aaliyah listened in stunned stillness. She asked if he loved her. He said yes. She asked if he was leaving because of someone else. He said no. She asked if this was truly what he wanted. He hesitated, but nodded. That hesitation stayed with her long after he walked out. The divorce followed with the same quiet finality. Papers signed. Boxes packed. No public scandal. To the outside world it was clean. To Aaliyah it was devastating. The hardest part wasn't losing him, it was losing the future she thought was secure. For a long time she replayed every moment, searching for where love had failed. Eventually she stopped searching and focused on survival. Healing came slowly. Through work. Through solitude. Through learning to trust herself again. Junseok meanwhile buried himself in growth and achievement. The company thrived. His name rose. Yet no success filled the hollow space left behind. He told himself he had done the right thing. That love sometimes required letting go. But standing in that jewelry store years later, watching Aaliyah move with composed distance, he realized the truth he had avoided. Their marriage hadn't ended because love died. It ended because fear spoke louder than honesty. And now the cost of that silence stood between them, polished and professional, asking how she could help him choose a ring. There is a particular kind of loneliness that settles in after love leaves quietly. It does not crash in or demand attention. Instead, it lingers in the background, filling ordinary moments with absence. For Aaliyah Brooks, that loneliness became her constant companion in the months following the divorce, a presence she learned to acknowledge without letting it define her. At first, she stayed in the apartment they once shared, convincing herself that familiarity would be comforting. It wasn't. Every corner held a memory she hadn't asked to remember. A chair he favored, a mug he never replaced, a space beside her on the bed that remained untouched. Eventually, she realized healing could not happen where her heart had been broken. She packed what she needed, left what she couldn't carry, and started over in a new city where no one knew her story. The move was not dramatic. There was no triumphant declaration of independence, no sudden transformation. Just quiet resolve. Aaliyah took work where she could find it, first as a sales associate, then slowly working her way into a small jewelry boutique that valued patience and trust as much as skill. She learned how to listen, to customers, to their hopes and hesitations. In helping others choose symbols of commitment, she found an unexpected sense of purpose. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when she caught sight of a familiar silhouette in a crowd or heard a voice that reminded her of his. On those days, she reminded herself that love, once given sincerely, was not something to regret. It had shaped her, strengthened her, even if it had not lasted. Over time, her independence grew. She learned to enjoy her own company. She filled her life with routines that belonged only to her. Morning walks, quiet evenings, books that kept her company through sleepless nights. Friends came into her life naturally, drawn to her warmth and steadiness. Slowly, the sharp edges of grief softened. Meanwhile, Junseo's world expanded in ways few could imagine. Success followed him relentlessly. Under his leadership, the company transformed into a global powerhouse. His face appeared in business journals. His name became synonymous with precision and power. Meetings blurred together. Achievements stacked higher and higher. From the outside, his life looked complete. Inside, it was anything but. Junseo filled his days with work because stillness reminded him of what he had lost. He told himself that regret was unproductive, that the past served no purpose beyond lessons learned. Yet every accomplishment carried a hollow note, as if something essential had been left behind. He avoided places that reminded him of Aaliyah. Avoided conversations that drifted too close to personal truths. Relationships came and went, none lasting long enough to matter. They were polite, distant, safe. Love, he decided, was a vulnerability he could no longer afford. Years passed this way, both of them growing separately, shaped by the same ending in different ways. Aaliyah built a life rooted in quiet strength and self-respect. Junseo built an empire fortified by discipline and emotional restraint. Neither of them knew how often they thought of the other. Aaliyah occasionally wondered if he was well, if he had found peace in the life he chose. She never reached out. Healing, she understood, required boundaries. Junseo, in turn, followed her career from afar when fragments of information surfaced. Never enough to cross lines, just enough to know she was surviving. When the board proposed an arranged marriage, it seemed logical. Strategic alliances were familiar territory. He agreed without enthusiasm but without resistance. It was easier than admitting the truth, that his heart had never truly moved on. So when he stepped into that jewelry store, intent on fulfilling an obligation, he did not expect destiny to interrupt him so directly. He did not expect to see the woman who had rebuilt herself from the pieces he left behind. And Aaliyah, standing behind the counter that day, did not expect the past to walk back into her carefully rebuilt present. Life after goodbye had taught them both resilience. What neither of them yet realized was that resilience had prepared them not just to survive, but to choose differently if given the chance. The days following their unexpected encounter passed more slowly than either of them anticipated. Time, which had once carried them in opposite directions, now seemed to circle back on itself, pulling old memories into the present with quiet insistence. For Junseo, every attempt to focus on work ended the same way, his thoughts drifting back to the jewelry store, to the calm professionalism in Aaliyah's voice, to the distance she had mastered so well. He told himself there was no reason to return. The ring could be chosen elsewhere. The decision could be finalized without complication. Yet something about leaving without closure unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Obligation had brought him into the store the first time. Restlessness brought him back. Aaliyah sensed him before she saw him. The door chimed softly, just as it had days earlier, and a familiar presence filled the space. She didn't look up right away. She had learned the importance of composure, of not letting anticipation control her reactions. When she finally lifted her gaze, Junseo stood near the counter, his expression thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady. "Good afternoon," he replied. There was a pause, brief but loaded. He gestured lightly toward the display cases. "I wanted to look again. If that's all right." "Of course," she said, already moving into position. Routine was a comfort. It gave her something solid to hold on to. As they reviewed the rings together, the irony of the situation pressed in around them. Aaliyah explained settings and stones with practiced ease, but inside she felt the weight of every word. Helping him choose a symbol of commitment for someone else was not something she had imagined facing so calmly. And yet, here she was, present, composed, capable. Junseo watched her closely, noticing the subtle confidence she carried now. She was not the woman he had left behind, waiting for explanations that never came. This Aaliyah stood firmly on her own ground. "This one is popular," she said, indicating a ring with a simple, elegant design. "Timeless. Understated." He studied it for a long moment. "It's beautiful." She nodded. "It suits someone who values tradition." The words landed carefully, deliberately neutral. But Juncio felt them all the same. Tradition. Expectation. Obligation. He suddenly understood that this ring, any ring, represented a future he had accepted without truly choosing. "I'm not sure it feels right," he admitted. Aaliyah looked up at him then, surprise flickering briefly across her face before she masked it. "Would you like to see other options?" "No," he said quietly. "I think I need to understand what I'm choosing first." Her hands stilled. For a moment the air between them felt charged, not with tension but with honesty waiting to be acknowledged. "Take your time," she said. "There's no rush." But Juncio knew there was. Not from the world, but from his own conscience. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice lower. "You seem, well." Aaliyah met his gaze evenly. "I am." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an invitation. It was simply the truth. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it more deeply than he expected. She inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement. "Thank you." They stood there, surrounded by symbols of promise and permanence, both acutely aware of the one they had once broken. Juncio realized then that buying a ring in this place from this woman felt wrong, not because of the past alone, but because it forced him to confront the present he was avoiding. "I don't think I can make this purchase today," he said at last. Aaliyah nodded, accepting his decision without comment. Professionalism once again became her shield. She returned the rings to their cases with careful precision. "If you change your mind," she said, "we're here." As Juncio turned to leave, he paused, his hand resting briefly on the counter. "Aaliyah," he said softly. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud since the divorce. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I never thanked you," he continued, "for what we had. For who you were to me." The words hung in the air, fragile and sincere. Aaliyah considered him for a long moment before replying. "You're welcome." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't rejection. It was acknowledgement. As he stepped out into the street, the decision before him felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. The ring he had come to buy no longer symbolized a future he wanted. Instead, it had reopened wounds he had never truly healed, and pointed him toward a truth he could no longer ignore. Sometimes the smallest objects carry the greatest weight. Some conversations are planned, rehearsed, and carefully timed. Others happen when resistance finally gives way to truth. For Kang Juncio, the decision to return to the jewelry store for the third time had nothing to do with rings and everything to do with the growing realization that silence was no longer an option. He told himself he needed clarity about the purchase. That he owed it to himself to be certain. But deep down, he knew the real reason. There were words left unsaid, and they had begun to weigh heavier than any expectation placed upon him. Aaliyah was rearranging a display when the bell chimed again. This time she looked up immediately. She didn't sigh. She didn't tense. She simply met his gaze, calm and attentive, as if his presence no longer carried the power to disrupt her balance. "Hello," she said. "Hello," Juncio replied. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not," she answered. "How can I help you today?" There it was again, the careful distance. Respectful. Neutral. It should have made things easier. Instead, it reminded him how much ground he had lost. "I don't think I need to look at rings," he said after a moment. I just needed to talk." Aaliyah hesitated, only briefly. She glanced toward the quiet store, then nodded. "We can step to the side for a moment." They moved to a small seating area near the window, sunlight filtering in softly. It felt strangely intimate despite the public setting. Two people sharing a conversation they had postponed for years. "I never meant to hurt you," Juncio began. Aaliyah folded her hands in her lap, listening. She had learned the value of patience, not as submission but as strength. "I know," she said gently. "But intent doesn't always change impact." He nodded, accepting the truth in her words. "I thought I was protecting you. From my family. From a life that would only ask you to bend and compromise." "And you decided that without asking me?" she replied, not unkindly. "I did," he admitted. "And it was wrong." The honesty in his voice was new, unpolished, vulnerable. Aaliyah felt something shift inside her, not hope, but recognition. This was the conversation she had once waited for, the one she had eventually learned to live without. I loved you, he continued. I never stopped. I just didn't know how to be brave enough to say it when it mattered. Aaliyah looked at him, then really looked. Time had changed him, but not completely. The ambition was still there. The restraint. But now there was regret too, and accountability. I needed honesty, she said quietly. Not perfection. Not protection. I know that now, he replied. They sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, just reflective. Outside, life continued as usual, cars passing, people moving forward, unaware that two lives were paused in a moment of truth. I'm engaged, Junseo said at last. Aaliyah nodded once. I know. But I haven't chosen it, he continued. I accepted it because it was easy. Because it didn't ask me to feel. And what are you choosing now? She asked. He met her eyes. I don't know yet. But I know I can't keep pretending the past doesn't matter. Aaliyah absorbed his words carefully. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, and she would not allow uncertainty to undo that work. I'm glad we talked, she said. But I need you to understand something. He waited. This doesn't mean we return to what we were. It doesn't promise anything beyond honesty. I understand, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know the truth. She considered him for a moment, then stood. Then thank you for telling me. As they walked back toward the counter, a comfortable quiet settled between them, not the silence of avoidance, but the pause that comes after something important has been said. Before he left, Junseo hesitated, then extended his hand, not as a grand gesture but as a simple offering. Aaliyah accepted it briefly, their handshake warm and steady. For both of them it felt like a beginning, not of romance but of understanding. And sometimes, that is where the most important journeys start. There is a quiet courage required to see someone again after truth has been spoken. Not the kind that demands bold declarations, but the kind that allows space, for uncertainty, for healing, for whatever might grow in between. For Aaliyah and Junseo, that courage showed itself in the simplest of ways. Their next meeting did not happen by plan. It was an ordinary afternoon when Aaliyah stepped into a small cafe a few blocks from the jewelry store, seeking a moment of calm before heading home. The scent of coffee filled the air, familiar and grounding. She stood in line, distracted by her thoughts, until a voice behind her spoke her name. Aaliyah? She turned to find Junseo standing there, his coat draped over his arm, surprise evident on his face. This time there was no counter between them. No professional roles to hide behind. Just two people meeting as themselves. Junseo, she said, offering a small smile. They exchanged polite greetings, then an unspoken question lingered in the air. Neither wanted to rush past the moment, but neither wanted to intrude. Would you like to sit? He asked finally. If you're not in a hurry. She considered for a brief moment, then nodded. I have time. They chose a table near the window. Conversation came slowly at first, safe topics, neutral ground. Or the city. Small observations about the day. But gradually ease replaced caution. Laughter surfaced unexpectedly, soft and genuine, surprising them both. It felt familiar in a way that did not hurt. Aaliyah noticed the way Junseo listened, really listened, without interrupting, without planning his next words. He noticed her confidence, the steadiness in her voice, the assurance she carried now. This was not a return to the past. It was an introduction to who they had become. When it was time to leave, they stood outside the cafe, neither quite ready to part. I'm glad we ran into each other, Junseo said. So am I, Aaliyah replied. He hesitated, then asked, would you be open to meeting again? Not to revisit old things, but to see where we are now. She studied him for a moment, measuring sincerity. Then she nodded. I think that could be okay. Their meetings became occasional and unhurried. Walks through quiet parks. Shared meals without expectations. Conversations that unfolded naturally, without pressure to define what they were. They spoke about mistakes, about growth, about the people they were learning to be. One evening, as they strolled along a tree-lined path, the air cool and peaceful, they stopped beneath a streetlight. The conversation faded, replaced by a comfortable silence. Junseo exhaled slowly. I don't want to rush this, he said. I just want to be present. Aaliyah nodded. That's all I need. In a moment that felt both new and deeply familiar, he opened his arms slightly, not assuming, not demanding. Aaliyah stepped forward, resting briefly against him. The hug was gentle, respectful, and grounding. It held no promises, only warmth. When they stepped apart, something had shifted, not dramatically but meaningfully. They walked on, side by side, aware that whatever lay ahead would require patience and honesty. But for the first time in years, neither felt the need to look away from what they felt. Sometimes reunion does not arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, asking only to be treated with care. There is a difference between honesty and full truth. Honesty tells you what happened. Full truth tells you why. For Aaliyah and Junseo, the gentle reconnection they were building created space for that deeper revelation, the kind that cannot be rushed, only earned. It happened on a quiet evening, after weeks of shared moments that felt steady and unforced. They sat on a bench overlooking a calm stretch of water, the city lights reflecting softly across the surface. There was no special occasion, no emotional build-up, just the sense that something important needed to be said. Junseo broke the silence first. "There's something I never told you," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not completely." Aaliyah turned toward him, her expression open but cautious. "I'm listening." He drew a slow breath. "When my family realized how serious our marriage was, the pressure increased. Not just expectations, warnings. They believed loving freely would weaken my authority. That choosing you would eventually cost me everything I'd worked for." She said nothing, allowing him to continue. "I believed them," he admitted. "I convinced myself that sacrificing us was the responsible choice. That letting you go was the only way to protect you from being constantly questioned, reshaped, or diminished." Aaliyah's hands rested quietly in her lap. She remembered the confusion, the unanswered questions, the nights spent wondering what she had done wrong. "You never gave me the chance to decide for myself," she said gently. "I know," he replied. "And that's the part one regret the most. I took away your agency. I chose fear instead of partnership." The words settled between them, heavy but honest. "For a long time," Aaliyah said slowly, "I thought I wasn't enough. That if I had been stronger, more adaptable, more acceptable, you would have stayed." Junseo's gaze softened with something close to pain. "You were always enough. I just wasn't brave enough to stand beside you." That admission did something unexpected. It loosened something in Aaliyah's chest she hadn't realized was still tight. Understanding did not erase the past, but it reframed it. The story she had told herself for years finally shifted. "I forgive you," she said after a moment. "Not because it didn't hurt, but because I don't want to carry that hurt anymore." Junseo exhaled, emotion flickering across his composed exterior. "Thank you," he said quietly. They sat there in shared stillness, the water before them unmoving, reflective. This time the silence was not heavy, it was healing. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Aaliyah continued. "And it doesn't mean we skip steps. I wouldn't ask you to," he said. "All I want is the chance to do better now." She nodded, accepting the sincerity in his voice. "Then start by choosing honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." "I will," he promised. "Every time." As they stood to leave, Junseo reached out instinctively, then paused, waiting. Aaliyah closed the distance herself, offering another quiet hug. It lasted a few seconds longer than before, grounded and sincere. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more important. It was accountability. And with it, the past finally loosened its hold, making room for whatever future they might choose to build, step by careful step. Choosing love is rarely about grand gestures. More often, it is about quiet decisions made consistently, even when they are inconvenient. For Kang Junseo, that realization settled slowly but firmly after the truth had finally been spoken. Words alone, he knew, would not be enough. If he wanted to be different this time, he would have to live differently. The engagement ended without spectacle. There were conversations held behind closed doors, expectations challenged, and assumptions dismantled one careful sentence at a time. Junseo did not blame anyone else. He did not offer excuses. He simply stated the truth, that he could not enter a marriage built on obligation when his heart was finally learning how to be honest. The decision surprised many, disappointed some, and unsettled the carefully arranged future laid out for him. For the first time he did not bend. Aaliyah learned of his choice not through dramatic confession, but through calm transparency. They were sitting across from each other in a quiet restaurant, sharing an easy meal, when he told her plainly. "I ended the engagement," he said. She paused, absorbing the words, then looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want there to be confusion," he replied. "I'm not making decisions to win you back. I'm making them to live truthfully." Aaliyah appreciated that distinction. She had spent too long rebuilding herself to be swayed by promises alone. What mattered now was consistency. Their connection deepened not through romance but through presence. Junseo showed up, without agenda, without pressure. He listened when she spoke. He respected her boundaries. When work called him away, he communicated openly instead of disappearing behind responsibility. Slowly, trust began to take root where fear once lived. They began again as friends. They walked through neighborhoods at dusk, talking about everything and nothing. They shared stories of who they had become during their years apart. Junseo spoke of leadership learned through loss. Aaliyah spoke of strength discovered through solitude. Each conversation added a layer of understanding that had been missing before. One evening, as they stood near the entrance of her building, Aaliyah turned to him. "I need you to know something." He waited. "I'm not afraid of loving you," she said. "But I won't lose myself again." "You won't?" he said without hesitation. "Not with me." She searched his face for certainty, for ego, for expectation. Finding none, she nodded. Time passed gently after that. Not rushing forward, not standing still. Their connection was no longer about reclaiming the past, it was about building something new with intention. When they hugged now, it was natural and unguarded, a quiet acknowledgement of comfort rather than possession. One afternoon, they visited a small art exhibit Aaliyah had been excited about. As she spoke passionately about a piece, Junseo watched her, not with nostalgia but with admiration. This woman had grown. And instead of fearing that growth, he felt honored to witness it. "I like who you are," he said later as they sat on a bench nearby. "Who you've become." Aaliyah smiled softly. "I like who you are becoming." That night, as they parted ways, neither questioned where they stood. They didn't need labels. They didn't need certainty about the future. What they had was intention, and that, they both knew, was powerful. Choosing love this time didn't mean choosing recklessly. It meant choosing with eyes open. It meant patience over fear, honesty over avoidance, and partnership over protection. And for the first time, both Aaliyah and Junseo were choosing not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Promises mean little when they are spoken too quickly. Aaliyah had learned that through experience, through words once offered with certainty and later withdrawn without warning. So when change began to unfold between her and Junseo, she paid attention not to what he said, but to what he did. And what he did was stay. Weeks turned into months, marked not by dramatic milestones but by quiet consistency. Junseo adjusted his schedule to make space for a life that extended beyond boardrooms. He attended events that mattered to Aaliyah, listened when she spoke about her ambitions, and supported her without attempting to reshape her dreams to fit his world. There was no pressure to define what they were becoming. Only the steady understanding that whatever it was being built with care. One afternoon, Aaliyah received an unexpected invitation, from Junseo, but not to a lavish venue or extravagant dinner. Instead, he asked her to meet him at the jewelry store where they had first reunited. She hesitated before agreeing. The memory of that place carried weight, but she trusted the calm reassurance in his voice. When she arrived, the store was quiet, bathed in soft afternoon light. Junseo stood near the counter, hands relaxed at his sides. There was no tension in his posture, only intention. "I wanted us to come here together," he said gently. "Not as a reminder of what hurt us, but as a place we redefine." Aaliyah nodded slowly. They walked through the display side by side, no longer separated by glass or obligation. This time they spoke freely, about design, about meaning, about what symbols mattered to them now. There was no rush, no pressure, just shared presence. When they stopped in front of a simple ring, understated yet elegant, Junseo looked at her. "This isn't a proposal," he said carefully. "It's a promise." She met his gaze. "A promise of what?" "Of honesty," he replied. "Of choosing you with clarity. Of never making decisions about us without you." Aaliyah felt emotion rise, not overwhelming but grounding. This was not the dramatic return of the past. This was something steadier. She reached out and took his hand, their fingers fitting together naturally. "That's a promise I can accept." They didn't put the ring on that day. Instead, they purchased it together and placed it carefully away, not as a symbol of ownership but of intention. Something to be chosen again when the time felt right. Later, as they stepped outside, the afternoon sun warm against their backs, Junseo opened his arms. Aaliyah stepped into them willingly, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. The hug was calm, certain, and full of quiet joy. "I'm proud of us," she said softly. "So am I," he replied. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a demand. It felt like an invitation. A new promise had been made, not bound by fear or expectation, but by mutual respect and shared growth. And for Aaliyah and Junseo, that promise felt stronger than any ring ever could. There are moments in life that demand nothing more than presence, attention, and the willingness to embrace what has been patiently earned. For Aaliyah and Junseo, this was that moment. After years of love, loss, and careful rebuilding, they had arrived at a place neither could have predicted, not because it was easy, but because it had been chosen deliberately, thoughtfully, and freely. The morning sunlight spilled softly through the windows of a small, intimate venue. It wasn't grand. There were no press photographers, no lavish displays. Just a few friends and family, quiet music in the background, and the warmth of togetherness that could not be manufactured. Aaliyah adjusted the hem of her dress, feeling a mixture of calm and anticipation. It was a strange feeling to be standing here with someone she had loved so deeply and walked away from, now standing with him not out of obligation but choice. Junseo stood at the front, his tailored suit impeccable, but his expression softer than it had ever been in public. Gone was the tension of corporate expectation. Gone was the practiced restraint of a man who had once let fear dictate his decisions. In its place was something far more profound: openness, vulnerability, intent. When their eyes met, it was like a conversation without words. Everything they had been through, the years apart, the mistakes, the misunderstandings, condensed into this single moment of recognition. Neither needed to speak. Both understood that arriving here was the culmination of patience, honesty, and enduring affection. The ceremony was quiet and sincere. Words were exchanged that reflected not just promises of love, but promises of understanding and respect. Vows were not dramatic declarations but acknowledgments of everything they had learned about themselves and each other. Aaliyah spoke of trust, resilience, and the joy of choosing to love again. Junseo spoke of courage, honesty, and the gratitude of finding a partner willing to journey alongside him despite the scars of the past. When it came time to exchange rings, they did so slowly, deliberately. No rush. No performance. The rings, chosen together months before, were symbols of intention, not obligation. As Junseo slid the simple band onto Aaliyah's finger, she smiled softly. "This feels right," she whispered. "It is right," he replied, his thumb brushing gently over her hand. "Because it's ours." And then they hugged, not hurried, not tentative, but steady. A hug that held every unspoken promise, every lesson learned, every moment of forgiveness and understanding. It was quiet intimacy, the kind that spoke louder than words ever could. They stepped outside afterward, hand in hand, greeted by sunlight and soft laughter from friends who had witnessed a love story unfold with care and patience. The world seemed brighter, not because it had changed but because they had finally arrived at a place where they could fully belong to each other. Not as possessions, not as expectations, but as two individuals who chose each other freely. As they walked together into the day, there was no pressure to define every future step. There was only presence, shared joy, and certainty in the knowledge that the hardest choices, made with honesty and courage, had led them here. For Aaliyah and Junseo, forever was not a distant promise. It was a daily choice made consciously, lovingly, and freely. And for anyone watching, listening, or reading their story, there was a quiet lesson to carry. Love that is honest, patient, and chosen cannot be forced or broken. It is resilient, enduring, and transformative. Thank you for following Aaliyah and Junseo's journey. Ring if you love this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to discover more heartfelt, emotional, and inspiring love stories. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Sparkles.